Oh, there's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello, BookTube. I'm Sean the Bookmaniac. Welcome back to another Friday Reads. I have so much to tell you. I've had a very interesting reading week. The good, the bad, and the ugly, perhaps. The only book I started, I also finished, so I'm going to skip the books I've started section. I have no bails. Maybe that should be the headline. No bails. Surely I gotta get at least one or two more bails in before the end of the year, hey? I have finished 5 books. Let's start with the one that I started and finished, and that was Haji Murad by Leo Tolstoy, translated by the dynamic duo Richard Pevere and Larissa Volokonsky. This was a buddy read with Lukash of Totally Pretentious, and I really enjoyed this. This is Lukash's book of the year. Fiction book of the year. Now, I didn't love it, but I really liked it. It was a great buddy read. It was a 2-day buddy read, and the writing was just phenomenal, and I was quite interested in most of the story. If you don't know, this was Tolstoy's last work, and it's a novel based on the real life historical figure of Haji Murad, who was a Chechen rebel sometime in the 19th century, and he goes over to the Russian side for his own complicated reasons, and it's about that. The character development in this little novella was just profound, and one of the characters is Emperor Nicholas I, and that was one of my favorite sections. So it goes from the very top right down to the common soldier, Russian soldier and Chechen rebels, and the women were portrayed also with great sensitivity. This also confirms for me that I don't ever want to read War and Peace, because the military part of this was just really boring for me, and that was why I couldn't give it a 5-star read. The other reason that I couldn't give it 5 stars is the ending. I mean, I guess if you knew history, which I didn't, you would know how this book ends, but I didn't know, and the ending is revealed about 20 pages before the end of the novel, and then all the details are colored in the last 2 chapters, and once I knew what happened, I didn't care how it happened. It's like, I'm like that with certain kinds of stories. Once it was revealed, I didn't care about the details, so I kind of fell asleep in the last 2 chapters and was a bit unsatisfied by that. But otherwise, it was a stunning piece of literature, just a little bit too macho military for my tastes, but I'm so glad that I finally read it. What I was going to say a minute ago was there was an Italian novel, I think in translation, Starnone's Trick, that I bailed on early because it starts out with a married couple, separating or getting divorced, and then the rest of the book is like a retrospective of why they got divorced, and it's like, I'm out of here, I don't care why they divorced. What a ridiculous plot structure. So this one was a little bit like that at the end for me. Obviously doesn't bother a lot of readers, didn't bother Lukash. He absolutely loved this. It was really invigorating to be in a buddy read with him because he was just gaga for this book. I thought it was really good, and I don't want to read War and Peace. In much less happy news, I finished Madhuri Vijay's The Farfield. This was a buddy read with Britta, and I have already filmed a fairly ranty review. I'm not sure whether I'm going to post it. I'm going to watch it again to see if it's not too ranty. This is a debut novel, but this is way too overhyped, I have to say. I hated it. I thought it was so fundamentally flawed that I wish I hadn't bothered. So, while there were things to admire, it was a colossal failure for me. Stay tuned for my review if I don't end up deciding not to post it, but I certainly had to have a little therapy session with the camera on after I finished it yesterday. This sucked big time! Now, you don't only have to be a long-term subscriber of mine, but you also have to, have a head full of useless information, such as the fact that I started this book during Nonfiction November in 2018, and I finally finished it this week. That is The Literary History of Saskatchewan, Volume 1. edited by my old professor at the University of Saskatchewan, David Carpenter. And like I say, I started reading it Nonfiction November more than a year ago, and put it aside for, good Lord, more than 6 months, and decided to finish it up this year. And I enjoyed it. 4 stars. It was a series of essays, and many of them, unfortunately, were written by professors, and most professors can't write. So those essays were subpar, but there were also essays written by professors, those rare breed that can write, that were very engaging. And so I enjoyed the writing some of the time, but I certainly learned a lot, almost all of the time, about the province where I grew up. And I am woefully underread in the literature of my own stomping grounds, and so my TBR has grown an arm and a leg from all the books I found out about, and it was really a valuable intellectual and literary experience for me. There is a volume 2, which is also on Scribd. I will probably tackle that next year, because I quite enjoyed it. Oh, and by the way, my old professor David Carpenter is... Actually, the only thing that he wrote in this was the introduction, which I really... It's been a year and a half since I read it, but I remember it was really good. David Carpenter is also a fiction writer, so he can write. Staying on the Canadian lit front, I also finished Sirius Blooms at Night by Shani Mutu. And sad to say, this didn't end well, so this went from about a 4-star read for me in the last third of the novel down to a 3. I didn't really care for it by the end. Nobody really talks about it anymore, but Cabell gave it a glowing review, and I've been hearing about it elsewhere recently and had never read it. I'm glad I read it, but it's not my kind of a book. Beautiful writing. This is set in a fictional Caribbean island, and one of the things that I loved about it was this is one of the queerest novels I've ever read. There's no bisexuals, I don't think, in this story, but otherwise... Okay, so here's a little aside. I hate the acronym GLBT. I'm going to leave out GLBT community because in theory I support that. Let's all work together and have a community. I've never heard of it. I've never been a part of it, so I don't believe it exists, but maybe it does somewhere. Great. But GLBT literature, that term just makes me see red. What the hell is that? I can understand gay literature, lesbian literature. I don't understand bisexual literature, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I think it probably does in YA and all kinds of fiction that I don't know anything about. Transgendered literature, great. But what is a GLBT novel? Well, this is a GLT novel for sure, because there are characters and plot lines about all of that. So that was fascinating, and I thought, for the most part, really well done here. It's about an old lady who comes into an almshouse. It's like a care home for seniors that have no money on this fictional Caribbean island, and the care worker at the home is a flaming gay guy. He is discriminated against and loathed by all the people around him on the island because he's so gay. And he takes care of this new resident, and she's an old lady who doesn't speak and has been accused of murder. That's what we know when she arrives. And he takes care of her and kind of nurses her back to some kind of communicative and emotional health. And then the story goes from there, and I enjoyed a lot about the story, but it became obvious to me by about the halfway mark that there was some magical realism in the story, which I hate for the most part, and I didn't hate it here, but it didn't work. For example, there's a character that ends up being rather important that sleeps 29 days out of every month and only wakes up one day, and it was like, oh, come on. Like, that's too Marquesian for me. And there was a few things like that just stole away from the otherwise fairly realistic aspects of the story. I loved the nature writing, but the symbolism was so heavy-handed by the end that if I heard one more reference to the Sirius tree or whatever it was, flower, I'm sure I was going to puke. Like, it was just overdone. Like, I hate symbols. Images are great. Symbols is ideological manipulation, and this was way too heavy-handed for me. The plot was so predictable from about page 30 that when the quote-unquote climax came in about a 50-page chapter, it was so melodramatically over the top that I wasn't sure I was going to finish the novel. But that's just me. Many people love this. It's not a book that you hear about anymore. I'm not even sure if it's easily found still in print. It's come from the late 1990s. I would read something else by this author. This one didn't wow me. And in the happiest news I have for you from the whole week of reading, I also finished today Starling Days by Rowan Hiseo Buchanan. This was kind of the opposite experience from the serious Blooms at Night novel, in that this got better at the end. So it was hovering at around a solid 4-star read, and then it had such a powerful ending that I had no choice but to give it 5 stars. I'm sitting here now thinking, am I going to do a full review of this? I don't actually know if there's many full reviews on BookTube. If there aren't, I might consider doing it. But in case I don't, I think I've got other reviews I want to do, and it's getting close to the end of the year, so I'd prefer not to. I thought it was a really excellent novel. I loved half of Rowan Hiseo Buchanan's debut novel, Harmless Like You, Harmless Like Me, Harmless Like You, and the other half I thought was weaker, so I only gave it 4 stars, and this was kind of feeling a little bit similar. I just don't think that she has quite got male characters down. They don't come alive for me on the page the way her female characters do. By the end of it, I realized, no, she has made quite a bit of progress with that the husband in this story was quite well drawn by the end, and I was emotionally invested in him in the final third of the novel. I love the protagonist so much. She is a young woman of mixed race and dealing with depression. So it's hard to get over how melodramatic the fact of their marriage, this young woman and her young husband, they've been married, 7 years or 10 years or something, starting out in New York and ending up in London. But the central fact of their marriage is that she attempted suicide on their wedding night. And that is such a melodramatic, that's not a spoiler, I don't think. It's in the first chapter. It's not on the inside flap, but it's in the first chapter. And I question whether that was overly melodramatic, but maybe not, because I loved her from the first page. Her mental health challenges and her character and her fucked upness and her beautiful, gentle, sad heart, all of that was so beautifully described that I just was transfixed by how much I cared about her. So that's what kept me going. There's stuff in the plot, not everything I thought completely worked, but it ended up with such a powerful ending that it's like, oh, I love you. So I heartily recommend this. It's not a perfect novel. It's a beautiful novel, and it's up for some Costa or some literary prize, and I hope it wins. I'm just expecting so much more. I'm expecting masterpieces from this woman. She is such a beautiful writer. This is not a masterpiece, but this is a fabulous novel. So that's what I've read. And again, I haven't started anything that I haven't already finished. So in terms of what's coming up in the coming week, continuing the Canadian lit theme, I will be buddy reading this Saskatchewan novel with Britta Bowler, Luna by Sharon Butala. I don't remember if this is a favorite novel of my mom's, but Sharon Butala is one of my mom's favorite writers. I can't remember if she's read this one or not, but it's the one that launched Butala's literary career. It's published in 1988, and I gave it as a gift to Britta just over a year ago, and then she said, let's buddy read it, and I said, oh, good idea, but I don't have a copy, so I got a copy, and the copy that I found in Saskatoon was an autographed one. So we will be buddy reading this starting Monday. And it is about a farmer's wife on a ranch in southern Saskatchewan. I usually make it a practice to not talk about how many books I've read in a year. I have made exceptions and kind of regretted it. I don't like to encourage the culture of any sort of competitiveness or So many people say when you get onto BookTube, you buy more books and you read more books, and I think reading more books is great, and I have no problem myself with buying more books, but I also don't want to contribute to a reading culture where the number of books that you've read is some kind of a status symbol. So I'm going to say this without giving the numbers. You know where to go on social media to find out my numbers, but I'm not going to give them here. If I start and finish one more book by the end of the year, I will have equaled my personal best in terms of how many books I've read in 1 year. If I start and finish 2 more, then I will have broken my record. Woohoo! So I don't know which books. I've got some ideas about which books. Obviously, they're not going to be long books. That's kind of what's on my plate, but I'm not going to speculate on what they might be. I will just tell you next week if I started any of them. So, that's my Friday Reads. Thanks for watching.